British development. In 1914, the British War Office ordered a Holt tractor and put it through trials at Aldershot. Although it was not as powerful as the 105 horsepower, 78 kilowatts, Foster Daimler tractor, the 75 horsepower, 56 kilowatts, Holt was better suited to haul heavy loads over uneven ground. Without a load, the Holt tractor managed a walking pace of 4 miles per hour, 6.4 kilometers per hour. Towing a load, it could manage 2 miles per hour, 3.2 kilometers per hour. Most importantly, Holt tractors were readily available in quantity. The War Office was suitably impressed and chose it as a gun tractor. In July 1914, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, a British Royal Engineer officer, learned about Holt tractors and their transportation capabilities in rough terrain from a friend who had seen one in Antwerp, but passed the information on to the Transport Department. When the First World War broke out, Swinton was sent to France as the Army's war correspondent, and in October 1914 identified the need for what he described as a machine gun destroyer, a cross-country, armed vehicle. He remembered the Holt tractor and decided that it could be the basis for an armored vehicle. Swinton proposed in a letter to Sir Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the British Committee of Imperial Defence, that the committee build a power-driven, bulletproof, tracked vehicle that could destroy enemy guns. Hankey persuaded the War Office, which was lukewarm to the idea, to make a trial on February 17, 1915 with a Holt tractor, but the Caterpillar bogged down in the mud. The project was abandoned, and the War Office gave up investigations. In May 1915, the War Office made new tests on a trench crossing machine, the Triton Trench Crosser. The machine was equipped with large tractor wheels, 8 feet, 2.4 meters, in diameter, and carried girders on an endless chain which were lowered above a trench so that the back wheels could roll over it. The machine would then drag the girder behind until on flat terrain, so that it could reverse over them, and set them back in place in front of the vehicle. The machine proved much too cumbersome, and was abandoned. When Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of the armored tractor idea, he reignited investigation of the idea of using the Holt tractor. The Royal Navy and the Landship Committee, established on February 20, 1915, at last agreed to sponsor experiments and tests of armored tractors as a type of land ship. In March, Churchill ordered the building of 18 experimental land ships, 12 using diplock pedrails, an idea promoted by Murray Suiter, and 6 using large wheels, the idea of Thomas Gerard Hetherington. Construction, however, failed to move forward, as the wheels seemed impractical after a wooden mock-up was realized. The wheels were initially planned to be 40 feet in diameter, but turned out to be still too big and too fragile at 15 feet. The pedrails also met with industrial problems, 40, and the system was deemed too large, too complicated and underpowered. Instead of choosing to use the Holt tractor, the British government chose to involve a British agricultural machinery firm, Foster & Sons, whose managing director and designer was Sir William Triton. After all these projects failed by June 1915, ideas of grandiose land ships were abandoned, and a decision was taken to make an attempt with U.S. bullet creeping grip Caterpillar tracks, by connecting 2 of them together to obtain an articulated chassis deemed necessary for maneuvering. Experiments failed and tests made in July 1915. Another experiment was conducted with an American Killen straight track tractor. A wire-cutting mechanism was successfully fitted, but the trench crossing capability of the vehicle proved insufficient. A Delaunay Belleville armored car body was fitted, making the Killen straight armored tractor the first armored tracked vehicle. But the project was abandoned, as it turned out to be a blind alley, unable to fulfill all-terrain warfare requirements. After these experiments, the committee decided to build a smaller experimental landship, equivalent to one-half the articulated version, and using lengthened US-made bullet creeping grip caterpillar tracks. This new experimental machine was called the No-1 Lincoln machine. Construction started on August 11, 1915, with the first trials starting on 10 September 1915. These trials failed, however, because of unsatisfactory tracks. Development continued with new, re-engineered tracks designed by William Triton, and the machine, now renamed Little Willie, was completed in December 1915 and tested on December 3, 1915. Trench crossing ability was deemed insufficient, however, and Walter Gordon Wilson developed a rhomboidal design, which became known as His Majesty's Landship Centipede, and later, Mother, the first of the Big Willie types of true tanks. After completion on January 29, 1916, very successful trials were made, and an order was placed by the War Office for 100 units to be used on the Western Front in France on 12 February 1916, and a second order for 50 additional units was placed in April 1916. France started studying Caterpillar continuous tracks from January 1915, and actual tests started in May 1915, 2 months earlier than the Little Willie experiments. At the Saugeen experiment, France tested an armored track tank prototype. The same month Little Willie was completed. Ultimately, however, the British were the first to put tanks on the battlefield at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. The name tank was introduced in December 1915 as a security measure and has been adopted in many languages. William Triton stated that when the prototypes were under construction from August 1915, they were deliberately falsely described in order to conceal their true purpose. In the workshop, the paperwork described them as water carriers, supposedly for use on the Mesopotamian front. In conversation, the workers referred to them as water tanks, or simply tanks. In October, the Landships Committee decided, for security purposes, to change its own name to something less descriptive. One of the members, Ernest Swinton, suggested tank, and the committee agreed. The name tank was used in official documents and common parlance from then on, and the Landships Committee was renamed the Tank Supply Committee. This is sometimes confused with the labeling of the first production tanks, ordered in February 1916, with a caption in Russian. It translated as, "With care to Petrograd," probably again inspired by the workers at Foster's, some of whom believed the machines to be snowplows meant for Russia, and was introduced from May 15, 1916. The committee was happy to perpetuate this misconception, since it might also mislead the Germans. The naval background of the tank's development also explains such nautical tank terms as hatch, hull, bow, and ports. The great secrecy surrounding tank development, coupled with the skepticism of infantry commanders, often meant that infantry at first had little training to cooperate with tanks. Russian development. Vasily Mendeleev, an engineer in a shipyard, worked privately on a design of a super-heavy tank from 1911 to 1915. It was a heavily armored 170-ton track vehicle armed with one 120mm naval gun. The design envisioned many innovations that became standard features of a modern battle tank. Protection of the vehicle was well thought out. The gun included automatic loading mechanism. Pneumatic suspension allowed adjusting of clearance. Some critical systems were duplicated. Transportation by railroad was possible by a locomotive or with adapter wheels. However, the cost would have been almost as much as that of a submarine, and it was never built. The Vezdakhod was a small cross-country vehicle designed by aero engineer Alexander Porokhovskikov that ran on a single wide rubber track propelled by a 10-horsepower engine. Two small wheels either side were provided for steering. but while the vehicles could cross ground well, its steering was ineffectual. In post-revolution Russia, the Vezdekod was portrayed in propaganda as the first tank. The Tsar tank, also known as the Lebedenko tank after its designer, was a tricycle-designed vehicle on 9mm high front wheels. It was expected that such large wheels would be able to cross any obstacle, but because of a flawed design, most of the weight was forced through the smaller rear wheel, which became stuck when tested in 1915. The designers were prepared to fit larger engines, but the project and the vehicle was abandoned. German development. The A7V was the only German tank of World War I that saw actual combat. A prototype was built in early 1917 for trials, with production of the vehicles beginning in October of the same year. They were used on about 6 occasions from March 1918. Only 20 were produced. Germany also had several other projects on paper, as well as other prototype tanks in development.